In the final chapters of his book, Punishing the Poor, Loïc Wacquant argues that industrialized nations have imported the United States' aggressive penal policies and their crime control tactics, as well as hyper-incarceration. The French presidential election of 2002 is an example where mainstream political parties launched massive law and order campaigns in spite of the fact that there was a decrease in reported street crimes for that year. Wacquant argues that the mass media has perpetuated the need for law and order, as the nightly news reports on high-profile crime cases and magazines are bursting with explosive reports of crimes, and then television dramas and reality programs such as Cops glamorize law and order. Interestingly enough, in France, there were calls amongst officials to intensify police operations, speed up judicial proceedings, and make sentences tougher. However, Wacquant asserts that white-collar crimes were by and large overlooked by officials, and they continue to be overlooked, much like in the United States. Wacquant contends that besides the French, British, Italian, Spanish, and German governments, politicians in other nations, including second world nations such as Brazil, South Africa, and Turkey, have begun to emulate America's use of super punitive penal policies. Wacquant insinuates that ever since the Soviet Empire collapsed, nations have been somewhat in awe of the way that the United States has had a laissez-faire attitude toward the market. Yet, at the same time, the U.S. has a paternalistic attitude toward controlling the lower class. To some extent, countries have tried to emulate this form of neoliberalism, which is most apparent within the United States. Often officials in other countries point to the way Rudolph Giuliani initiated a tough law and order campaign in order to make crime melt away in the American metropolis of New York City in the 1990s. However, Wacquant points to various studies which argue that the escalation of police in New York City had very little to do with the falling crime rate. Rather, Wacquant contends that this was due largely to age demographics, as a large population of residents in New York City had simply maturated out of crime. He also points to the International Crime Victimization Survey to illustrate major cities within the U.S. still have a substantially higher homicide rate, which is nearly 5 times higher than those of France, Germany, or England. Wacquant attributes the high homicide rate to gun ownership, maintaining that 1/2 of all households in the U.S. has some kind of a gun. Wacquant argues very strongly against James Q. Wilson and George Kelling's broken windows theory. Broken windows theory posits that if police officers crack down on small incivilities, such as public drunkenness and loitering, this will reduce crime. It should be noted that the broken windows paradigm is an extremely important innovation in policing, yet Wacquant single-handedly dismisses it. And in what might be perceived by some scholars as a bit of a cheap shot, Wacquant actually criticizes Wilson and Kelling for not initially publishing their article in a peer-reviewed journal. Rather, they initially published this in a cultural magazine, albeit a very respected one. He also maintains that broken windows has no link whatsoever with any criminological theory. Wacquant cites studies to back up his assertion, and he points to one critic of broken windows theory, and this critic asserts that a mayor such as Giuliani, who adopts this style of aggressive policing, is almost like a doctor who gives a facelift to a cancer patient. By this, Wacquant suggests rather strongly that the broken windows strategy, as advocated by Wilson and Kelling, is counterproductive and may actually lead to more crime. Nevertheless, argues that Comstat and zero tolerance policies are American innovations that are currently being exported, at least to some degree, across the Atlantic and diffused throughout Western Europe. Wacquant, who was born in Montpellier, France, devotes an entire chapter explaining how this country has toughened up on crime considerably. For example, he opens the chapter discussing how the French Ministry of Justice launched a television advertising campaign to attract the 10,000-odd guards who would be needed to work in the country's expanding prison system. A year later, in 2004, legislation would be passed where genetic fingerprints were collected from inmates and DNA profiles were collected from mere suspects. Oddly enough, according to Wacquant, this was not done in cases of white-collar crime or financial crime. This is in spite of the fact that the economic cost of white-collar and business crime in France, as well as in other advanced nations throughout Western Europe and America, is considerably higher than that of the run-of-the-mill delinquency or even violent crime. Also, this same legislation also doubled the amount of time a suspect could be held for questioning to 4 days, and it prevented many suspects from seeing a lawyer for up to 48 hours. Also, this 2004 law allowed French police officers to pay informers, install hidden cameras in suspects' homes, and incite crimes to help investigations, whatever that may mean. Wacquant asserts that the French government was highly influenced by the United States and imported some of its most oppressive crime tactics. Wacquant argues that on both sides of the Atlantic, the prison is a grossly inefficient response to crime. The United States has the dubious distinction of incarcerating more of its people than any other country. According to official reports, 737 persons are imprisoned per every 100,000 people in the United States. A report released in 2008 indicates that in the United States, more than 1 in 100 adults are now confined in an American jail or prison. The United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. In both the United States and France, inmates come overwhelmingly from unstable fractions of the urban proletariat. And in fact, those who are in prison are substantially likely to have lived below the poverty line prior to being incarcerated. For example, both aid to families with dependent children recipients and jail inmates live near or below the poverty line, with some living substantially lower than the poverty line. Both groups tend to be disproportionately African American and Hispanic, meaning that they come from higher rates of those communities and there's overrepresentation, and the majority of individuals in both groups did not finish high school. In the United States, during the neoliberalism era, officials have scaled back the welfare state while expanding the penal state in order to manage the poor, despite the fact that prison fare is much more expensive than welfare. Wacquant also argues that throughout the history of incarceration, penal facilities have never truly been an effective form of rehabilitation. On the contrary, he argues that prison facilities may actually be schools for criminals, and in some cases, spending a few years at what he refers to as the Gray Bar Hotel might actually become a badge of honor and enhance one's credibility on the street. On another note, Wacquant argues that poor people who suffer from psychological afflictions have no business being held in penal establishments when the fundamental reason for their arrest and incarceration is the sheer lack of mental health care on the outside. This, of course, is a point which Risdon Slate and Wes Johnson also make in their 2008 book, The Criminalization of Mental Illness. Wacquant concludes his book, Punishing the Poor, by asserting that the rolling out of the penal state is one of the ways that officials have tried to bring order to the sense of disorder and social insecurity that has come about in the age of deregulated capitalism. Also, under neoliberalism, Americans' urban proletariat lives in a punitive society and is often subjected to enhanced monitoring, zero-tolerance policing, mandatory minimum sentencing, boot camps, and may even be the subject of various crime and punishment reality television shows. The punishment of criminals has proven to be a remarkably successful political strategy for candidates. Yet, it should be noted that, at least in America, we simply cannot afford to continue incarcerating individuals at the current rate we are now. Wacquant does not make this point in his book, but then again, it was first published in French in 2004. So in many respects, he fails to take into consideration the fact that America is broke. Prisons are overcrowded and we simply cannot afford to punish, even though this may be desirable on some level to many Americans. Nevertheless, a break away from mass incarceration, it ultimately will be inevitable and in the works. Again, Wacquant does not allude to this in his book, but then again, the first draft of this work was published in France prior to the 2008 global economic meltdown. It would be very interesting to see what Wacquant might have to say in light of the current economic recession. Wacquant asserts that advanced nations have imported U.S.-style criminal justice measures. However, today, it is likely that an outsider can see that it is very expensive to punish. Given this, Wacquant may need to write an addendum to his book. One thing, though, is apparent from reading his work. The proactive penal apparatus in the United States is related to economic deregulation. The neoliberal state that we live in embraces laissez-faire economics at the top, with the soft touch of libertarian proclivities favoring the upper class. Meanwhile, the poor are subject to the invasive, expansive, and expensive penal fare. America's current incarceration binge is not a deviation from neoliberalism, but rather one of its core ingredients.